This is Michael Reid Trice with the Religica Theolab at the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. And today I'm in conversation with Professor Nancy Snow, who is the director of the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing at the University of Oklahoma and a professor of philosophy. We're discussing civic friendship, moral repair, and the importance in all of our lives of creativity. Professor Snow, I really want to ask first and foremost for our listener, what is a virtue? What counts as a virtue?
Well, that's a great question, Michael. And it's a great question because virtue is not a word that you hear very often. It tends to have some negative connotations. For one thing, it's a bit reminiscent of Victorian morality, which we often associate with prudishness. And there's also a term that I believe is called virtue signaling, which is not exactly supposed to be a good thing. But just to be clear, a virtue in the sense that I understand it, which is the sense that Aristotle put forward in the Nicomachean Ethics, is an entrenched disposition of character. And that disposition entails the ability to perceive, think about, deliberate about, and be appropriately motivated to provide virtuous actions. Maybe a better way of thinking about this is to think in terms of specific virtues like courage, honesty, trust, generosity. Those are terms that we still have in our vocabulary that may be more familiar to members of the general public and people who aren't steeped in philosophy and in Aristotle. So when I say that we have virtues, what I mean is that people have the traits of honesty, generosity, bravery, and so on, and that if they have them in the Aristotelian sense, they're appropriately motivated, they reason well using practical wisdom, they are often successful in hitting the target of their virtue, and they can be relied upon to act virtuously in many different settings. So, for example, if we say that someone is honest in the Aristotelian sense, we mean that they are honest in a variety of situations, for example, when they're talking with their spouse, when under oath in court, when submitting their income tax returns, and so on. So that's kind of a quick and dirty rundown of what virtue is.
It's fascinating. And you're mentioning also virtue, as you described it in the Aristotelian sense, as a disposition of character. It sounds to me that there may be some kinds of virtues that are more popular now and maybe less popular 100 years ago or less popular 100 years from now. Are there certain virtues that are a disposition of a culture's sense of character that seem to just last every society and every civilization? How do you respond to that?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that there are some virtues that we cannot live without. And I think those virtues can be seen in just about every society. So it's hard for me to imagine a society existing without the virtue of trust, or virtue of cooperation, or generosity or honesty. I don't know how people could get along in society if those virtues didn't exist. On the other hand, there have been societies that value some virtues more than others. And I think here of the ancient Spartans who were very heavily into courage as a physical virtue, or the warrior virtues. We certainly do value courage, and we value courage on the battlefield for our soldiers. But physical courage might not be so much to the fore today as it was for the Spartans. And so that's an example that springs to mind. What I think is more easy to see is that we can identify certain vices with certain societies. So if you think back to the Gilded Age of America, that was characterized by newly rich people who were very greedy, who sought to entrench and flaunt their wealth, and who wanted to be recognized, people of a certain culture. So, you find this portrayed in novels such as Elizabeth Wharton's The Buccaneers or Henry James's The Golden Bowl, where in Wharton's work, newly rich Americans would come to England in search of brides, and they wanted to have titles. They wanted to marry into the aristocracy. And it seemed to work well for the British aristocracy, some of whom were pretty broke by that time. But the idea was that these newly enriched American industrialists wanted to enhance their status by getting an aristocratic title in the family. So from that particular day and age, you can talk about greed, superficiality. I don't know what else to say in terms of those vices, but you get the idea that depth and sincerity and genuineness were not virtues that they prized, but those virtues were precisely what they needed. So the idea that I have in mind is that virtues can function as correctives. So in the individual case, for example, if I have a tendency to lie, honesty can correct that. It can function as a corrective. If I have a tendency to be greedy or to be stingy, generosity can correct that. So for a society like the Gilded Age, virtues such as authenticity, genuineness, sincerity, a lack of graspingness, a lack of greed could have been correctives. And I think in our own day and age, we can see a certain panoply of vices coming to the fore. So we see things like deceit, manipulativeness, corruption in places of power. We live in an age of fake news and alternative truths, or I should say alternative facts. And so from that observation, we can maybe give a diagnosis which yields the kinds of virtues that might help correct the vices that we see on such a large scale.
What do we do in a context, it seems, so much like our own today, where you have at least two significant constituencies who are defining truth itself, often in antithesis to the other, and where you have what appear to be maybe even emerging systems that have alternative narratives of truth? So, for instance, if it were the case between you and me, what I trust might look to you to be superficiality, or what I might say as honesty, you might refer to as manipulation. How does virtue get us there in terms of offering a corrective when you have that kind of breach, perhaps, between even truth-telling itself in society?
I think in order to answer that question fully, we'll have to expand our consideration beyond the realm of virtues of character into what have been called the intellectual virtues or epistemic virtues. And so intellectual virtues are aimed at finding truth. And so they are virtues like open-mindedness, curiosity, intellectual humility, love of learning. And so in addition to wanting to be honest, I think we also need to be open-minded, curious, and intellectually humble. And by intellectual humility, I mean being aware of the fact that we don't know everything. And some of these virtues work very nicely together. But the real deep issue, I think, lies in terms of a third category of virtues, the civic virtues. And those are the virtues that we need to live together successfully in society. So a lot has been said lately about the level of incivility in our society. And this is, of course, not unrelated to these competing narratives that you spoke about, because frequently those competing narratives are not put forth in open-minded ways, but they're put forth in ways that are quite combative and quite polarizing and indicative of a closed-mindedness or dogmatism held by proponents of these divergent views. Well, we might say that being civil is one way of approaching these issues. Now, this is not without problems, right? Because civility has certainly come in for its share of criticism. So members of minority groups have been criticized as being uncivil when their protests seem to breach certain norms of politeness. And this could be used as a silencing tactic. I tend to prefer the virtue of civic friendship, which goes back to ancient times. But the real question for us is, if we want to get out of this cycle of competing narratives that are put forth in combative and polarizing ways, there will have to be a fairly complex cluster of virtues that enable us to do that. And central to all of this is cultivating in people the motivation to bring those virtues to bear in terms of those discussions. And that, I think, getting the right motivation up and running is the central challenge.
I think of what you're saying in terms of civic friendship, and I'm reminded of the term in Greek koinonia, this sense of visible unity, seeking and living daily, as you've identified, with this complex, maybe alloyed set of virtues. I'm just struck in terms of civic virtues, and I wonder if in your work, the combination of virtues such as generosity plus curiosity plus humility does something to our civic space and how we show up. That each of those is a deeper sense of clustering of virtues that together are able to unmask maybe the kinds of alternative truth tellings that doesn't prize, for instance, curiosity and generosity as a way of even experiencing the world. What do you think of that?
I think it's a good start. I think it's a very good thought that those virtues can play that role. I think in our present situation, before we can get there, we might need to focus on an aspect of virtue ethics that I think has been underexplored and needs to be further explored in the future. And that is the notion of moral repair. Because we are in a state in which there have been some harms and wrongs done in our society to various groups, and sometimes over centuries. And so there is a real sense of grievance. And I tend to think that some groups have a genuine grievance to bear, and others do not. So I can think of various groups in this country who feel themselves mightily harmed and mightily aggrieved. And I have to say I don't agree, whereas the same is not true of others. But I think bringing the virtues to bear, first of all, on the issue of moral repair will help us to get at the deeper underlying feelings that motivate these competing narratives. And so that would be a specific focus of the virtues that you mentioned, I think. I think before we can move to a space of mutual trust and mutual goodwill, we have to move to a space of moral healing. And before we can get there, we really have to examine the wounds that have been inflicted upon people. So what I'm suggesting is, starting from the vices that we see in our society, we can identify virtues that are correctives. But how will they function as correctives? And there I think we have to dig pretty deeply into our history, our sense of grievance, the psychological pain that we experience, and reach some conclusions or formulate some hypotheses, probably a better way of approaching this, about how virtues might be valuable in effecting a course of moral repair that can then put us on a track to healing that might be a healthier place to begin constructive dialogue than simply skipping that step of not looking at the wounds, because I think that's led us to this place in the first place, that certain grievances were not taken seriously and have boiled over. And so that's where we need to start in applying virtues and in moving toward true civic friendship.
I've been in a room where an emphasis has been placed on healing, and the almost immediate response, especially in the last year, of some of those in the room has been to very much follow deeply emotionally and existentially what you just identified, which is healing in moral repair is not the first work. The first work in terms of examining the wounds, and I'm also hearing what you're saying, that work alone it may outlast all of us. It may be that we are really, to do that work effectively, will require a cross-generational emphasis over the course of time to get there. But let me just pause for a moment and ask what we should be doing or thinking about in terms of virtues in everyday life that do bring us into this kind of civic friendship as we're working out the moral repair that's essential for our shared future?
Again, a great question. Before I get to that, though, let me make one further comment on this issue that you just raised about healing and moral repair. I've been in discussions in the past in which individuals who are implicated in wrongdoing and injustices have quickly jumped on the bandwagon and said, well, we need to heal. And that, too, can be a way of covering over what the wounds are without really addressing them. To skip to healing without actually coming to grips with the wrongs and harms. And that, I think, is morally offensive. So don't talk about healing unless you're going to truly, truly address the issue of harm, wrongdoing, and woundedness in which people live. In terms of what we can do in everyday life, that is a good question, too. And it's not an easy one to answer because everyday life can be difficult. It's difficult to be good, right? It's difficult to be patient. It's difficult to be generous with your time because we are only human. And we've been under a lot of stress as a nation in the past 4 years with the COVID pandemic, with severe weather events. There have been any number of things that have put us under stress. And so the idea is to be mindful as best as you can to treat others with care and concern and gentleness. And I try to remember, although I often forget, that many of us walk around with a lot of burdens. We have considerable burdens to bear. But by the same token, we're also only human. We can only do so much. We can only do the best we can. We do sometimes make mistakes. When I make mistakes, I tend to beat myself up. That's not good either. So, I think virtue, to go back to some very ancient thoughts about this, virtue is care of the soul, right? It's a psychological endeavor, and it's not something that we can do by ourselves. We need to do it in community.
Civic friendship, as I'm hearing you describe it, is fundamentally, maybe even more than words. It's the full fleet of expression and giving ourselves the time, really, isn't it, to approach one another with a kind of gratified spirit, I can't think of a better way to put it at the moment, that sees others not diced up by our own sense of temporal increments, but instead sees them as a subject that requires their own kind of space and time, and that I may have to augment all of my assumptions about what I need in that moment in order to be generous toward them. You're just making me see this in a kind of three-dimensional way, the complexity in that civic space for what's required, really, for virtue to flourish.
Yeah, it's a very complex situation, and our society doesn't help us. We are not helped by the way that we live today in having civic friendship or even healthy relationships. And I think that's true for a number of reasons. One is that we live in a high-pressure society where time is one of the great commodities. Time is something that, you give your time, I give my time, and it's a big deal. And we also live in a society in which our attention is constantly in demand, right? So before we started the podcast, you said you were going to turn your cell phone off so we wouldn't have any alerts. But just think about what your cell phone does to you. You get notifications, you get nudges, you get text messages, you get emails. There's a constant competition for your attention. And when we want to be civically friends or civic friendship, when we want to be generous, I should say, with people and to foster civic friendship, we need to put that aside. And we need to deliberately create spaces in which we can have quality time with people. We really do need to start insulating ourselves against the demands that really dehumanize us and keep us from interacting with each other as true human beings. During the month of February, every Wednesday evening, a friend who is the executive director of the Kirkpatrick Foundation invited me to do a series called Fun Flourishing. And so we had a series of conversations with just whoever showed up on hope, sincerity, reflective listening as a civic virtue, and then ascesis, the Stoic discipline of how to live, was the last topic. And that turned out to be really valuable for people. They really enjoyed it. They really liked it. During that hour, we were all there for each other. And, I would basically throw out a few ideas, and then people would take the ball and run with it. And so, there was no direction. There was no course. There was just, what do you want to contribute? What does this say to you? What do you have to say about things? And so I think just making time for those kinds of discussions and interactions, when people feel that they're in a safe and comfortable place, that they can reveal themselves and share what's important to them. I think just doing that would be a significant way of promoting civic friendship, of maybe even of mending some fences. I don't think it would be enough to get at the deep wounds that we have, but it would be a start toward those conversations in situations of mutual trust.
Hope, sincerity, reflective listening, ascesis, and all of those you just described, the capacity to be creative with one another in assessing the wounds or moving toward healing, is that fundamentally what's at stake? We have to be able to create with one another toward a shared horizon of the future that we believe should have purchase in the world, should impact our lives and the lives of those coming after us.
I really like that way of putting it, Michael, because I think you put your finger on something important, and that is the importance of creativity. And so I've thought a bit about creativity, not as much as I would like to, but co-creating with other people can be a tremendous privilege and a tremendous challenge. Right now, I'm also involved in the What is Home project, and this is funded by the Kirkpatrick Foundation, and it's a digital storytelling project involving students from 2 high schools. And one of the really interesting things about it is that we have created it as we moved along. And so the great thing about the Kirkpatrick Foundation is that they give you the leeway to do that. So they give you the funding. You can put together, or at least what I did was put together sort of an outline of what we were doing. And then in connection or in conjunction with people from the Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication here and the 2 high schools, Clinton High School and Norman High School, we are really co-creating this project with and for the students. So that creative activity will have a product at the end of it, and it's sort of a formal structure. But that's a nice way of thinking about how we can create together. And together we can create products, or we can create shared social spaces and relationships. But I really like that notion of allowing yourself to be creative in those situations. I think creativity is an understudied virtue, or at least I feel that I haven't given it due diligence, and I need to take a closer look at it.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter.